Well, thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about Rene Guénon's The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Again, we are going to finish it. So last week we talked about chapters 1 through 23, and so here we did 23 to the end. And this was much less similar to the revolt against the modern world. It was much more esoteric and much more talking about what traditionalism looked like, what it should look like, and ways that it has been sort of subverted in the modern day. So you have this thing he keeps going into, this I don't know what you'd call it, a comparison between anti-tradition versus counter-tradition. So you have traditionalism, right? That's true traditionalism. And then you have this anti-traditionalism that is going to be against, classic traditionalism. But then you also have the counter-traditionalism, which is sort of subversive in the fact that it might appear traditionalist on the surface, but it is, in fact, not. So it is even worse in certain ways than anti-tradition. So that would be counter-tradition. So that's pretty much what we're going to get into today. So I'm not going to go chapter by chapter. Instead, I had a whole lot of stuff highlighted, so I think it's good if we just go, just go through some of these quotes. So the first chapter I thought was pretty interesting was this one about psychic residue. I believe that's what the chapter was called. Yeah, it's psychic residues. So essentially it talks about institutions, people, and all of these things leaving behind almost like a spirit, right? So one of these things, there's, people obviously leave behind a psychic residue, as you call it, but also something like the church, right? So these institutions or the state of America or something. There's this idea of what it is, and this is left behind, even as that thing might be gone or subverted. But so here's a quote from that chapter that I found pretty interesting. So it is, however, as well to add that before things reach that point, and as soon as traditional organizations are so diminished and enfeebled as no longer to be capable of adequate resistance, the more or less direct agents of the adversary can begin to work their way in with view to hastening the time when subversion will become possible. They are not always sure to succeed, for whatever still has some life can always recover itself. But if death takes place, the enemy will then be found to be, as it were, in possession, and ready to take advantage of his position, and to use the corpse for his own purposes. So really, really interesting. And when he says the adversary here, right, that's a very common word used to refer to Satan, so a satanic influence. And this is a word that he uses throughout this. So even though Guénon is not really coming from a strictly Christian background, he often uses this term satanic to refer to something antinomian, subversive, and mostly creating an inversion of something, right? So we talk about this case in the terms of a tradition, right? A tradition can be subverted, and I think a lot of this can apply directly to the church, right? So a lot of people have strong opinions about the Pope and the current church, but you look at it starts to become subverted, right? So it becomes an agent of the adversary. But this is an important part, right? For whatever still has some life can always recover itself. So because you still have some life left in the church and some goodness, it can fight against that satanic influence. But if it comes to the point where the church is ultimately, killed, right? You remove every single good person from it and destroy the doctrine, then it's just going to be this walking corpse that is fully a tool of Satan, right? And this is almost a very literal interpretation, right? But this could refer to very many other things, right? Just the idea of tradition as a whole, right? And how even something like the United States, right? Is there still life left in the United States? Can it recover itself? Or is it this walking corpse that is only going to be used for a satanic subversion? So, interesting to think about. And then a few sentences later, there's another sentence. So it says, It may be observed in passing that the danger of the misdirection of certain kinds of knowledge, of which this last is a very clear example, accounts for much of the secrecy that is quite natural in normal civilization, but the moderns show themselves to be entirely incapable of understanding this. For they commonly mistake what is really a measure designed as far as possible to prevent the misuse of knowledge for a desire to monopolize that knowledge. So once again, something that this calls back to what we talked about last week. He had a whole chapter about secrecy in general. So this whole modern mindset, it's very anti-secrecy. So if there's anything that is secret, it must be evil, right? Rather, this idea that some knowledge needs to be preserved and protected because, certain knowledge in the wrong hands is susceptible to subversion, right? So once again, this just brings us up that secrecy can be a good thing and it can be a necessary thing, right? Especially when we think of things, more esoteric religious doctrines and how that, is played out for the church with respect to Protestantism and things like that, right? We could get into that again, but I don't think that's totally necessary. So pretty interesting chapter on psychic residues and basically what's left over after any kind of traditional institution has been defeated. So now there's a chapter on deviation and subversion, which is pretty straightforward. But he starts to go into what does it mean to be satanic. So he has this whole section says, the word satanic can indeed be properly applied to all negation and reversal of order, such as is so uncontestably in evidence in everything we now see around us. Is the modern world really anything whatever but a direct denial of all traditional truth? At the same time, and more or less of necessity, the spirit of negation is the spirit of lying. It wears every disguise, often the most unexpected, in order to avoid being recognized for what it is, and even in order to pass itself off as the very opposite of what it is. This is where counterfeit comes in, and this is the moment to recall that it is said that Satan is the ape of God, and also that he transfigures himself into an angel of light. So a really, really awesome passage here. And we talk about, the satanic as a negation and reversal of order. So you take something that is good and make it sinister. And the various ways to do that involve, number one, lying, right? So you take something that is, a non-truth and you hold this up as truth, right? So we think something like egalitarianism is satanic because it sort of presents itself as truth and presents itself as good and righteous, but it is not truth, right? It is subversive. It is satanic in that way. And we also talk about the counterfeit, right? And this is a word that he goes into a lot, right? So you have this the fake, right? And so he says Satan as the ape of God, ape meaning a mimicry, right? So Satanism sort of presents itself as an alternative to God. It presents itself as an alternative to traditional morality, and we see this very often, right? There is a satanic temple, and you talk to these people that are actual Satanists, and you say, well, isn't Satan evil? And then they'll say something along the lines of, well, actually, this is it's like ironic or something, and it's actually because because we don't believe in Satan or God, right? We use this Satanism to say that we're anti-traditional, traditional Christian values, and therefore we're like this secular humanist way of looking at things. And you see the pure irony here, right? That it presents itself exactly the way Satan would present himself, right? Satan doesn't come down and say, "Hey, I'm evil. Join with me." He's not Darth Vader, right? He's not gonna, reach out his hand and ask you to join his conquest over heaven. No, he's going to present the world to you and say, "No. Actually, I'm the good guy, and this is the proper way to be," right? And so the satanic influence, right? It's this reversal. It's this subversion. And Satan comes appearing as, a different God, right? An alternative moral structure that is actually evil, right? And it presents itself as being good and correct and righteous, but it is none of these things. So pretty interesting, and he goes through many more examples of that as we go through. He talks very much about the counterfeit or the parody, and how these are ways of subverting tradition. So in 31, he has a whole chapter dedicated to just sort of outlining what is tradition and traditionalism, capital T. So he says, all misuses of the word tradition can serve this same purpose in one way or another, beginning with the most popular of all, whereby it is made synonymous with custom or usage, thus bringing about a confusion of tradition with things that are on the lower human level and are completely lacking in profound significance. But there are other and more subtle deformations, all the more dangerous because of their subtlety, and share the common characteristics of bringing the idea of tradition down to a purely human level. Whereas, on the contrary, there is nothing and can be nothing truly traditional that does not contain some element of superhuman order. Really interesting stuff there. So, this word tradition, lowercase t tradition, has been sort of bastardized away from this capital T tradition, because now everything can be a tradition, right? You go to the same bar with your friends every what is it, Black Wednesday, and that's a tradition, right? That's a tradition you've created. Is there anything sacred about that? No, it's totally man-made, and it might make you feel good and have some attachment, but it's not part of a superhuman order, as they say, as Gunan says. So to be, a true tradition, right, we need to have something connected to this capital T traditionalist framework. Right, and that's this thing that he totally outlined in the first half of the book, talking about, instead of the reign of quantity, right, the reign of quality, and how we are, submitting to some sort of supra-rational, supra-human order, something that is beyond our reasoning, something that is beyond something purely human. And this is going to essentially be God, right, God to us. So to be traditional, you have to have some connection with a higher power, some connection with God, some connection with something spiritual, suprahuman, right? And anything other than that is going to be subversive, right? It's a satanic, like we said. It's sort of a counterfeit. It presents itself as tradition, but there's really nothing traditional about it. And this includes even some of the, oldest secular traditions. You think of things like our country, right? Any kind of like Pledge of Allegiance, right? That's like a secular tradition, which is in a way very subversive, because you're sort of, pledging allegiance to something that is not part of a supra-rational, superhuman order, right? So this is an example, it might not be popular to think of it that way, but it's very much a subversion of something that would be traditional. So that's from the chapter of tradition and traditionalism, and he has another section from that chapter where he says, they talk about the humanist tradition and a national tradition, despite the fact that humanism is nothing if not an explicit denial of the superhuman, and the formation of nationalities was the means employed for the destruction of the traditional civilization of the Middle Ages. Now this is really interesting, because I don't know if I really agree with the second part, right? Was nationalities the creation of nationalities the means employed for the destruction of the traditional civilization of the Middle Ages? He doesn't really expand on that, so I don't really know where he's going with that. But then he goes on to say, in the circumstances, it would not be surprising if people began one day to talk about Protestant tradition, or even lay tradition, or a revolutionary tradition, or if the materialists themselves ended by proclaiming themselves the defenders of a tradition, if only their capacity as the representatives of something already belonging in a great measure to the past. So very interesting, right? And so now these things that are new constructions, right? Protestantism, materialism, revolutionary thought, post-Enlightenment thinking. These are now becoming so old, hundreds of years, that you now have a tradition associated with them. And that's a lowercase t tradition, right? Because there's nothing capital T tradition about that. So once again, we're taking this inversion, right? We take something that is supra-rational and beyond our reasoning, and we are using this satanic subversion, right, to say that now it is something that is purely human, something that is purely man-made, right? Something like exactly what we said: Protestant tradition, lay tradition, revolutionary tradition, materialist tradition. These are not traditions. They're just historical things, but they are not having anything to do with, like we said, a supra-rational and superhuman order. Cassius says revolutionary tradition sounds like some modern leftist rhetoric today. Yeah, I could definitely see that being a popular talking point, right? We need to live up to our revolutionary tradition, whatever that is, some Marxist type thinking there. But it really does show how, subversive this kind of language is, right? You want to stay true to something. And if you just arbitrarily decide that something to be some historical reality that you're going to call tradition and act like that gives it any kind of significance, it's false, right? It's a falsehood. Whereas we know that capital T tradition has, I keep saying it, right, supra-rational significance, something spiritual, beyond human order to it, and that's what makes it relevant. That's what makes it important, unlike all of these other things. So then he goes on to talk about the plague of Neo-Spiritualism, and I think we kind of know what he's talking about here, right? Sort of the people that say they're spiritual but not religious. This whole, new age kind of religion thinking. And he goes off about this, and he says, moreover, even the schools that affect an appearance of archaism by making use in their own way of fragments of uncomprehended and deformed traditional ideas, or by disguising modern ideas as they think fit under a vocabulary borrowed from some traditional form, either Eastern or Western, all of which things, by the way, are in formal contradiction to their belief in progress and evolution, are constantly preoccupied in adapting these ancient ideas, or what are imagined to be such, to the theories of modern science. So, the Neo-Spiritualists, right, they try to find some kind of reconciliation between tradition and modernity, right, when there really can be none. And so really all you're doing is subverting tradition and shoehorning in your modern ideas, right? And I think you look at plenty of these, well, I'd say almost every Christian in the modern day, right? They're not willing to say that evolution isn't real, right? They just sort of they work it into their belief somehow that they believe in, simultaneously believe in Darwinian evolution, but also creationism, and it doesn't make any sense at all, right? Things like Christian Science, right? That's obviously not traditional, and these people think that they're the vanguards of some kind of like ancient tradition that they're bringing into the 21st century, but really they're just destroying all aspects of that tradition and beating it into the ground. So, he is not having a very fond view of neo-spiritualists, and I think this is a pretty common thing we see. Obviously, we have our strong opinions about these types of people. And then he goes on to talk about psychoanalysis. So this is pretty interesting. And how wow, wait, hold up. I just got 2 subs. I didn't even know you could do that. Does that cost money? Did you actually give me money? Thank you very much, Fortnite Sex Haver. You are a real a real champ. Thank you very much. Gifted the subs to Siddhartha and Cassius, 2 very well-deserving guys, so thank you very much for that. All right, well, to get back onto the topic, we have the Misdeeds of Psychoanalysis. That's what he was talking about. And he sort of talks about how psychoanalysis is this another level of subversion, because you're sort of conflating these 2 separate ideas between the psychic and the spiritual, right? Psychic meaning pertaining to the mind, and spiritual meaning pertaining to the spirit. And theirs are not the same thing. And if you think you can, psychoanalyze somebody, this is a purely materialistic way of looking at things. And if you start believing in this idea of psychoanalysis, he calls it a sort of initiation into an anti-traditionalist worldview. Right? Once you start to believe in this, it is no longer traditional. Right? You're subscribing to a totally materialist worldview, and can no longer find anything traditional in that. So it's a aspect of the reign of quantity. So a section here, he says, there is certainly something more than a mere question of vocabulary in the fact, very significant in itself, that present-day psychology considers nothing but the subconscious and never the superconscious, which ought logically to be its correlative. And I think that's another really, really interesting point. Isn't this totally materialistic way of viewing that you're going to say that this thing that we have called consciousness, that we don't really understand, but you're going to have something underneath that, right? Something underlying that we sort of understand even less, and then you're going to call it the subconscious, right? As if it is less profound. Whereas in reality, you should also have something, a superconscious, right? Something beyond your conscious, something that is connected to a spiritual, something outward pressing down, right? As opposed to something below your consciousness pressing up, right? And that's how we characterize the subconscious. But to say that there's not also something superconscious is pretty disingenuous, right? Because I would think that morality in general, right, to most people, this feels like a supra-conscious phenomenon. Do you feel this morality just because of your conditioning, because of your socialization, because of your upbringing? I think to a certain degree, most people feel it as like a pressure from above, meaning, right, some spiritual pressure that is beyond rational, beyond consciousness. And, we call this God, right? We have God pushing down on us, and that would be our superconscious at work. And you could even, start talking about, is God just the collective superconscious, right? And that's a pretty interesting thing to think about, that most psychologists don't, because they don't even have this as a concept. But then he goes on to talk about supraconscious and what exactly he means by that. So, he says, correspondingly, since the domain of psychology is not extended upward, the superconscious naturally remains as strange to it and as cut off from it as ever. And when psychology happens to meet anything related to superconscious, it tries to annex it merely by assimilating it into the subconscious. This particular procedure is almost invariably characteristic of its so-called explanations of such things as religion and mysticism. Together with certain aspects of Eastern doctrine, such as yoga, these are therefore features in this confusion of the superior with the inferior that can properly be regarded as constituting a real subversion. Great passage, because I think it really puts things into perspective here as far as psychologists, right? They try to attribute everything that they can't explain. They just write it off as subconscious phenomenon, right? As it's something, latent in your brain, something that is there but has purely material reasoning, right? And you'll even see certain philosophers like Jung, who you might even consider a more religious type psychologist, psychoanalytic, but he still has this conflation of something spiritual with something subconscious, right? So he says this, certain collective ideas of religion are resulting from some subconscious drive, right? Whereas in reality, if you're a truly religious person, you don't believe that to be subconscious. You think that's a supra-conscious drive, right? This is pressing downward from truth, right? And so now this psychology, right, it extends upward and not just downward, right? We don't just have the subconscious, but we have something that it links the mind to the spiritual, as opposed to taking all of the spiritual and shoehorning it into some theory of the mind, which is really quite interesting. And I think that's one of the problems that we sort of see even with some of these spiritual modern types, right? And some of these people will say something, they believe religion is some kind of collective unconscious experience, and I don't think that that's a very good characterization, right? Because that's sort of disregarding of truth, right? And it's less to do with the fact that we're human that makes us have this subconscious desire for spirituality, but because we are created by something non-human, that we have this supra-conscious desire imposed on us, if that makes any sense. And I think that's a very interesting way of looking at things, and it creates an interesting dichotomy between two types of thinking. So then he moves on to chapters on initiation and what he calls pseudo initiation. So when he talks about this, I imagine it as something like these like fake traditionalist organizations, most notably something like the Freemasons, right? You have all of the makings of like a hardcore traditionalist type of organization, but really everything about it is satanic and subversive. Right, so he calls this like a pseudo tradition with a pseudo initiation, and he sums it all up with a very good quote here. So he says, "Should anyone now put forward the suggestion as a sort of extenuating circumstance that there are always in these affairs, despite all their faults, some elements derived from genuinely traditional sources, an answer would be this. In order to get itself accepted, every imitation must take on at least some of the features of the thing imitated, but that it is just what makes it so dangerous is not. But that is just what makes it so dangerous. Is not the cleverest lie, as well as the most deadly, precisely the lie that mixes most inextricably the true and the false, thus contriving to press the true into service in order to promote the triumph of the false." So, long passage, but if we start to break that down, right? So we talk about how these things sort of masquerade as traditionalist, and the only way you get Fortnite sex haver just followed the channel. Very hilarious. But in order to get people on the board with something that is non-traditional, right, you need to masquerade as traditional and sort of sprinkle in some falsehood there. And that's the only way that that's useful. In the same way, right, when we were talking about Satan, right, and Satanism, you don't just come up to somebody and say, hey, all the stuff that's working really well traditionally, we're just going to throw that all away. No, you need to present it as a purely moral alternative, right? You don't say, hey, come be evil. You say, well, what actually is good, and maybe this frame of looking at good and righteousness is more correct, right? So now in the same way, I keep going back to Freemasonry as a good example, because from what I've read about it, this is exactly how it operates, right? It says, well, actually, we are a primarily Christian group, and we believe in, promoting some Christian doctrines, but, like, we have this one catch, is that we're much more universalist, and, like, we also accept Jews, and we kind of believe that, there's this one God that sort of caters to all people, and we don't really look down upon other religions, right? And then it sort of starts with that level of subversion, right? You take a lot of truth and then sprinkle in some falsehood, some subversion. And then as you move through the ranks of Freemasonry, and once again, this is from what I've read, I don't really know for sure if this is how it works, but eventually, it gets to be this totally subversive, satanic institution, right? Your New World Order type way of looking at things. And the way that this is accomplished, right, you can't just throw a total amount of satanic subversion at people and expect them to buy into it. You have to start with a certain amount of tradition and let people make it sound like you're selling them a better product, right? Say, well, we like all these things about tradition, but we're going to change this little thing, and we think this will make it better. And then as you continue to do that, you've now totally subverted whatever the original tradition was. And so, this chapter is dedicated to basically frowning upon that as a pseudo initiation, as opposed to something like, confirmation would be a true initiation, right? An initiation into a traditional institution, or any other kind of coming of age, rite of passage, sacrament that you might find in any other traditionalist religion. So interesting there. Then he's a chapter on prophecies. Basically, prophecies are all bullshit. And I guess the one thing I want to say about that is you do see often, and you see this a lot in Protestant religions and also among Jews, right? I think they call it like millenarianism. The belief that there's going to be some kind of second coming, and you can predict exactly when that's going to be. Whereas, Catholics and, sane people, they say, well, yeah, we believe that there's going to be a second coming. We understand that through revelation, but we have no idea when it's coming. Whereas you have certain Protestant groups and certain Jewish sects, like, the Sabbateans with Sabbatai Zevi. They said, well, actually, this is the second coming, and the end of the world is coming, exactly 30 years or something. And they all prepare for that, or prepare for the rapture, or something like that. And this is very subversive, because you're sort of taking what is a real traditional, capital T, type of sacred prophecy, and trying to add this humanistic element that you have added yourself. And so, incredibly subversive, incredibly bad, but we don't really need a whole chapter to explain to us why that is. I mean, that's sort of intuitive. So the last big thing I have here is in a section in the second to last chapter, where he talks about the great parody, right? And what exactly is happening with traditionalism as a whole, right? So he says it's called the great parody, or spirituality inverted. So what are we going to see going forward as we see the peak of this anti-tradition and counter-tradition at work? So he says, after the egalitarianism of our times, there will again be a visibly established hierarchy, but an inverted hierarchy, indeed a real counter-hierarchy, the summit of which will be occupied by the being who will in reality be situated nearer than any other being to the very bottom of the pit of hell. And this is really interesting how much, this perennialist type philosophy lines up exactly with, traditional Christianity, and also lines up with the kind of things that we're seeing today, right? So essentially, he talks about anti-tradition versus counter-tradition. So egalitarianism is strictly anti-tradition, right? You say, no, we don't believe in tradition, we believe in this secular ideology. But then counter-tradition takes it a step further and say, well, actually, we are going to take everything that is traditional and do the opposite of that, and that is our new tradition, right? And so that's what he calls the counter-hierarchy. And we are beginning to see this more and more today, right? We're sort of gone past the idea of egalitarianism to now you have the most satanic, subverted people being at the top, right? Like, can a trans person do any wrong? Can a gay person do any wrong? Now a pedophile, right, is a person deserving of pity. they should have some, type of say. And then increasingly you're seeing this, within just the world power, right? And I think I talked about this in my debate a little bit, but you sort of have a hierarchy, right? We currently have a very hierarchical society, but it is not a moral hierarchy. It is a material hierarchy. So this could be the ultimate end of the reign of quantity, right? Now you have the hierarchy of quantity, where those with the most material wealth are seated at the top with disgusting amounts of power, and the catch here is that the more material wealth you have, the less moral substance you have, because in order to be a wealthy person, you need to reject moral substance. So we have this ultimate inverted hierarchy, and the people at the top of us are the most evil, the least moral. And to wind this back, right, now you talk about in Revelation, right, in the Catholic faith, when is the end of the world going to appear, right? And well, this is something E. Michael Jones says, but he says when the synagogue of Satan is at its peak, right, then will be the time for the second coming of Christ. So the end of the world, right, the rapture, all of this Revelation language comes when the world is at its most evil, right, when it has been fully subverted by Satan, and you have this inverted hierarchy like he's talking about, right, like Ganon is talking about, right, and it also, corresponds to the Kali Yuga, right, and this is, the Hindu doctrine of a dark age, right, a dark age ruled by quantity. So very interesting how all this sort of coalesces in the ending here, and it sort of gives an interesting perspective. Are we in the end times, right? Is this the final stage of the reign of quantity? And the final chapter kind of goes into this, and it sort of adds, a final white pill on top of all this, because I guess the book as a whole, it could seem pretty depressing, because it's really just talking about how shitty the world is and how much we've gone away from tradition. But the final chapter on the end of the world essentially says that this is not something to really pay much mind to unless you have been subverted by the modern world. Right, if you're viewing things in a purely materialistic sense, then obviously the end of the world and the end of an age is going to appear tragic to you, right? This is all that you have. Whereas if you do take the traditionalist mindset and a spiritual mindset, a non-materialist mindset, then it's just going to be another death followed by some kind of rebirth, right? If you believe that this world is all we have, then it is going to be cataclysmic. Whereas if you believe that there is something beyond, then it is just another stage and not really something to worry about so much, right? I mean, if you're a Christian, you should be awaiting patiently the coming of Christ, right? The second coming. You want the end of the world to happen. That doesn't mean that you're going to be a participant in it. You're not going to join the modern world. But because you stand alone from modernity, you have nothing to fear, right? And if you're not a Christian, same thing. You just have to stand outside of the Kali Yuga, right? And this is something that, Evola talks about, right? Ride the tiger, in a way, is what he calls it. Because as you watch the world descend into the reign of quantity, the Kali Yuga, the dark ages around you, if you are that strong pillar of traditionalism and spiritualism, then you are not going to be phased. You're not going to be affected. You're going to be this, strong pillar through the storm. And I guess that's sort of the white pill here, right? So as long as you yourself carry the traditionalist torch, the modern world will not impact you. And I guess that's the way that we have to be. So I think that's a good way to wrap all of this up. So I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts on that? I think it was an interesting book. I thought it was a little bit verbose at times, and definitely esoteric, hard to get through towards the end. I mean, it gets really complicated ideas here. But altogether, good stuff, definitely. And definitely worth reading. I think it was a good one for the club. I don't know how many of you guys even read it. So yeah, if you have any of your thoughts, please share them. Otherwise, I will probably end this segment and move on to our next segment. So I'm going to make 2 separate recordings. So tonight we're going to have an additional segment where we talk about just how we present ourselves and this right-wing movement going forward, right? Not to act like we are the vanguards of something large here, but I think it's a discussion worth having, of talking about the best way to present ideas and the best way to carry ourselves going forward. So Siddhartha says, definitely good ideas here, and science, I think, definitely represents the reign of quantity in full force. Yes, and more importantly, not just science, right, but scientism, right, the pure belief in materiality and the mythology of science behind that. Not that science is wrong. Yeah, exactly. Materialism and its, interaction with science, that is where we get into a lot of trouble. All right. Well, I think I will end the recording here, and then I will open up the phone lines for anybody who wants to chime in. So, goodbye for those of you who are just checking out the book club video.